late spring of 1863, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, had a really tough choice in front of him. His armies had been fairly successful in the previous 2 years. They had not been able to stop the North from pushing their way through down near the Mississippi River. But by and large, the Southern armies had held up fairly well, at least in terms of victories. But now Davis had a real problem. And that deals with a little place called Vicksburg down on the Mississippi River, down in Mississippi, and you can see it here on the map. Vicksburg is the key to feeding the Confederates. And when I say feeding, I mean feeding the armies, feeding the civilian population. The Confederates had managed to hang on to Vicksburg because it is it's surrounded by water. It's got steep cliffs. It's a really hard place to attack, putting it gently. And there's a range of area around Vicksburg, stretching from Vicksburg down to a place called Grand Gulf, which the Confederates, because of the terrain, had been able to keep. Now, it's important that they keep Vicksburg in that section down to Grand Gulf, simply because they do need food. Where do they get food from? Well, they need beef from Texas, and they need crops from Arkansas, Texas, some of Louisiana. Basically, these areas are feeding the Confederates, and they're feeding the Confederate armies, and they're feeding the Confederate people. Now, that's not to say that even with that corridor open, that the Confederates had a lot of food. They didn't. But if you close that Vicksburg corridor, which the Union desperately wanted to do, if you close that Vicksburg corridor, there's going to be a lot less food. It's that simple. And Napoleon said that an army marches on its belly. That's pretty much true. Later on in the war, Robert E. Lee won't even be able to feed his horses, and much less his men. And so as a result, the South is going to have problems. They're just simply going to have a hard time staying alive if you lose the Vicksburg corridor. Grant had pulled off one of the great strategic moves of all time. You were seeing how Vicksburg is just surrounded by water, cliffs, all kinds of ugly stuff. Grant, though, had managed to surprise the Confederates, slip past Vicksburg, get ashore, and then come up on Vicksburg from behind. Should not have been able to do that, but the Confederate generals in that particular neck of the woods had not been particularly competent. And as a result, Grant was coming in tighter and tighter on Vicksburg. And of course, if you don't hold Vicksburg, as I say, you run out of food. It's that simple. So that, under normal circumstances, would have been President Davis's first concern. How do I hold that Vicksburg corridor open? And really the best way to hold that open is to take some troops from Robert E. Lee's army, which has been successful in the East, although we're going to see it's an apparent success, that have been successful in the East, and move them to Vicksburg. Probably Longstreet, James Longstreet, the very stout second command to Robert E. Lee, essentially take his troops and move them down there. Davis is going to do that later on, maybe a little bit too late. But still, that would be the move that you would take if you were playing for the long game. That is, the idea would be not to win the war, but to wear out the North. In other words, the South can lose the war, the North probably can't win it. And so as a result, if you're playing for the long game, if you're planning to wear out the North, which is very much what the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong did to us in Vietnam, if you're planning to wear out the North, this is the way to do it, to hold that corridor open and keep that food flowing in. But there's something else going on, and that is Bobby Lee, Robert E. Lee. Nobody ever called him Bobby Lee that I know of at that time. Lee had a considerable string of victories or drawn battles, and it looked good. It probably looked better than it actually was. But in the 7 days battles near Richmond, Lee managed to push a general by the name of McClellan down to the James River away from Richmond. Now, there were approximately 7 battles, depends upon how you count them. Lee had probably lost most of them, but he had simply outmaneuvered and outthought McClellan. And frankly, McClellan had no stomach for battle. By the way, if you're going to be a field commander, you should have a stomach for battle. And what Lincoln was doing, keeping McClellan in place, is beyond me. Lee, after pushing McClellan away, moved north toward Washington, defeated John Pope, a third-rate commander at best, then to Antietam, where McClellan had another swing at Lee. McClellan should have destroyed Lee's army. It's almost unbelievable that he didn't destroy Lee's army, because Lee had certainly placed his army in a place to be destroyed, and didn't do it. And Lee walks away with him, a draw, a stalemate. At Fredericksburg, a second-rate commander, who I actually think was better than McClellan, a fellow by the name of Ambrose Burnside, threw troops at a suicide position. And so Lee gets an enormous victory at Fredericksburg, not particularly because of his skill, because Burnside actually outmaneuvered him at some points, but because Burnside just simply couldn't come up with a new battle plan when he needed it. And as a result, his troops are slaughtered. And then at Chancellorsville, Lincoln finally picks a really capable general, a guy by the name of Joe Hooker. And Lee, to his credit, saw a chance to do some fairly audacious moves in coordination with Stonewall Jackson, and wins. But Lee had an army about half the size of Hooker's. And what happened was Hooker lost his nerve. And in later life, he said, the truth is, I just lost faith in old Joe Hooker. Well, that's what happened. So Lee has faced no top commander, nobody in the ranks of Grant or Sherman or even Thomas. And so as a result, Lee gets a bunch of cheap victories in here. They weren't cheap in terms of human power, human lives. They were very expensive in terms of human lives. But Lee looks better than he actually was. And but nevertheless, appearances are important. And so when Lee proposes that he take his victorious army, and remember how many battles they've won, and in the 7 days winning that campaign, Lee convinces Davis that he can go north, and Lee's army could move quickly. There's no knocking Lee's speed. Lee knew perfectly well that he could get north of the Union Army. And if he gets north of the Union Army, and you can see that little box there that says Gettysburg, if he moves north of the Union Army, then he believes that he can come down and defeat the Union Army piece by piece as it's chasing him. He says so very plainly. He makes there's no bones, there's no back door here. Lee says very clearly, I'm going to chop the Union Army up piece by piece as it's chasing me. And then he can go to Philadelphia, he can go to Baltimore, he can go to Washington. And the important thing is if he does this, Britain and France are almost certain to intervene. And if Britain and France intervenes, the war is over. So here's Davis's dilemma. If you don't keep that Vicksburg Corridor open, you have to win in the north, because you don't have any other choices. You're going to run out of food. But if Lee goes north and wins, then you don't need the Vicksburg Corridor, because Britain and France are going to intervene. So which one do you choose? Lee could lose a battle up north, in which case you lose the battle up north and you lose the Vicksburg Corridor. So you got a choice here. You can either go for the knockout punch with Bobby Lee and his very successful army, even if I said these successes are more apparent than real. or you can play the long game and try to feed your people and your armies. And, who knows how long it would take to wear down the North, but, you're still going to get food. And you're also going to stay at war for many more years, or at least many more months. And, who knows how that's going to work out. So this is one of the worst dilemmas that any U.S. leader has ever faced. I realize that this is on the southern side, but it is a dilemma. What the heck do you do under these circumstances? Success bred a dilemma. Send Lee north, go for the knockout punch with a very victorious army, or protect that Vicksburg Corridor and try to wear down the Union. Those are your choices. And that's a choice that Mr. Davis faced in the late spring of 1863. Okay, everybody, stay safe out there. Stay lucky. And above all, stay healthy. Everybody take care.